Hi there, I'm the Macabre, and I'm here to assist you today. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel before you watch it, since I know you use it to fall asleep. What time are you viewing right now, and where are you from? I was briefly awakened by the sound of glass smashing. I tried to tell myself that it had all been a dream as I lay still in the strange bed, my pulse racing, but then I heard it again. A thump, followed by the upstairs floorboards creaking. Someone was home. For a long time, I had solely been looking after the Johnsons' kids. A few hours seemed like such a nice couple when I was hired last week, eager for a night off, while their two little ones slept peacefully upstairs. Now as I lay in the darkness of the guest room, I cursed myself for taking this job in a neighborhood I barely knew. My trembling fingers fumbled for my phone on the bedside table. The intense glow of the screen made me squinting as I dialed the 911 number. Just as I was about to press call, I hesitated, and if it was nothing and if Mr. Johnson had forgotten something and returned, I would feel like an idiot if I called the police for a false alarm. Swallowed hard and hung my legs to the side of the bed. The wooden floor was cold against my bare feet as I slipped towards the door, pressed my ear to the surface, Lisa straining to hear any sound in the hallway. Nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. After all, I was about to breathe a sigh of relief when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a door slowly opening upstairs. My blood froze. The children's rooms were up there. Without thinking, I slammed open the door to the guest room and I ran into the hallway. The house was pitch black, but I'd done a full tour earlier that night. I knew the stairs were right to my right. I went down them two at a time, my hand sliding down the soft railing. When I got to the top, I stopped and listened. Attentively, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the rapid beating of my own heart in my ears. "Hello," I knocked softly with my voice just for on top of a whisper. "Mr. Johnson, it's you." Silence. I walked cautiously down the hallway, squinting in the darkness. The first door to my left was open. Little Sarah's room was clearly reminiscent of seeing her closed. After wrapping the hours ago, I took a deep breath and poked my head inside. The moonlight filtered through the translucent curtains, illuminating the small figure of Sarah huddled under her. Rosa seemed to sleep peacefully, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. I was about to turn around when something caught my attention. There, at the other end of the room, a shadow seemed to move. My breath stopped in my throat. I blinked several times, trying to adjust my eyes to the gloom. Slowly the shadow took shape, a tall, broad-shouldered figure. I was motionless in the shadow. A child, not a father checking on his sleeping daughter. An intruder. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a moan, something, because the figure's head suddenly turned sharply towards me. In the dim light, I saw a flash of eyes shining under a dark hood. Time seemed to stop for a moment, and then, without warning, the figure lunged towards me. I didn't think, so I just ran and rushed down the hallway, my bare feet hitting the wooden floor. I heard heavy footsteps pursuing me from behind me, and I nearly fell, clinging to the railing to prevent myself from rolling. My mind was racing, trying to figure out where to go. The front door was locked. I had checked it myself before going to bed, and the kitchen must have had a knife or something useful. To defend myself, I turned left and ran across the living room in my haste. My hip slammed into the corner of the coffee table. A sharp pain ran down my side, but adrenaline kept me moving, bursting into the kitchen, my eyes frantically sweeping the room. There on the prima, a block of wood full of knives, I lunged at him, pulling out the biggest one just as my pursuer appeared at the entrance. "Stay away," I shouted, holding the knife in front of me. "I called the police. They are on their way." It was a lie, but I prayed that he would not notice. The intruder stopped, assessing the situation. In the dim light that came through the kitchen window, I could make out more details. Man, probably in his trees, dressed in dark clothes and a balaclava that hid most of his face. "Calm," he said with a surprisingly calm voice. "There's no need for anyone to get hurt. Just give me what I want and I'll leave." "What do you want?" I asked, hating how much my voice was shaking. He stepped closer and I squeezed the knife tighter. "You know what I'm here for. Where do they keep the things?" I shook my head frantically. "I don't know. I'm just the babysitter. Please just leave. I know about the children." He interrupted me, his tone hardening them. "Okay," I said, lowering the knife slightly. "I'll show you alone. Alone. Don't hurt anyone." The intruder nodded, signaling me to move forward with shaky legs. I walked down the hallway, my mind working quickly. I had no idea where the Johnsons kept their valuables, if they had any. I was just buying time, hoping with all my might that someone else would notice something was wrong and come to rescue us. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, an idea crossed my mind. It was risky, but it was the only option I had. "It's upstairs," I said, starting to climb into the main room. I could feel the intruder right behind me. As I ascended, my heart was beating so hard that I was sure he could hear it too. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped, pretending to orient myself, which growled impatiently. I pointed to the door at the end of the hall, the main room. When he began to come forward, I acted with all my might, pushed him away, caught by surprise, tripped his foot, hooked on the carpet. For an instant he hesitated at the edge of the upper step. Then, with a pressure that would have been almost comical under other circumstances, he fell backwards. I saw him roll down the stairs, his body striking the steps with a series of loud thumps and grunts. When he was finally left behind, motionless on the ground, it didn't move for a long moment. I froze, unable to believe what I had just done. Then the reality of the situation hit me squarely. I had to act fast. I ran downstairs, carefully dodging the intruder's body. My hands were shaking, so much that I could barely hold my phone. But somehow I managed to dial 911. 911, what is your emergency? Please help, Jade. There was a break in. I'm babysitting and a man came into the house. He fell down the stairs. I don't know if he's breathing. Please come quickly. The next hour passed in a whirlwind of sirens, flashing lights and endless questions. Police cars and an ambulance filled the quiet suburban street. Officers scoured the house as paramedics tended to the intruder who was still unconscious. I sat on the front porch with a rough blanket over shoulders, answering questions in a dazed state. Yes, I was alone with the kids. No, I don't know him. Yes, I'm sure he forced in. It wasn't until I saw the Johnson's car stop in the driveway that the weight of what had happened hit me completely. Mrs. Johnson ran up to me, her face pale with concern. "Oh, honey," she whispered, wrapping me in a tight hug. "You're all right, you're safe now," over his shoulder. I watched as paramedics pulled a stretcher out of the house. The intruder was strapped to it, an oxygen mask covering his face. He was alive. The realization brought immediate relief followed by renewed fear. The children managed to ask between bland, "Are they okay?" Mr. Johnson assured me, who had just returned from checking their rooms. "They slept throughout the incident thanks to you." When the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion settled in my body. The Johnsons insisted on taking me home, thanking me again and again, concerned for my well-being. Before I left, a friendly police officer informed me that the intruder was a known thief wanted for a series of robberies in the area. Thanks to me, I would be off the streets for a long time. I should have felt proud, relieved, maybe even a little heroic. Instead, when I finally crawled into bed in my own house, all I felt was a deep tiredness and a nagging fear. Every creak of the house, every murmur of the wind through the trees, made me shudder. I knew with a certainty that pressed my chest that it would be a long time before I felt completely safe again. The shadows in the corners of my room seemed darker, more menacing, and as I finally sank into a restless sleep, a thought echoed in my mind: sometimes monsters in the dark are all too real. The first drop of rain blew my windshield like an omen of misfortune. In a matter of seconds, the sky opened, releasing a torrential downpour that reduced visibility to a few meters between. I closed my eyes with white knuckles on the steering wheel as I maneuvered down the winding road. It was then, in the middle of the storm, that my car decided to breathe its last. "No, no, don't!" mumbled the throttle frantically as the engine coughed and died. The car slowly slid to the side of the road, if you could call that narrow strip of asphalt with barely a meter of hard shoulder. Before the precipice, I sat there listening to the rain hit the roof, trying to calm my breathing. This wasn't part of the plan. My road trip had started as a thrilling adventure. Now I was stranded in nothingness. No service on my phone and no transportation. A lightning illuminated the desolate landscape, and in that brief instant I saw something that made my pulse stop. A pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. Quickly approaching, relief flooded me. Another car meant help, a chance to get out of this mess. I watched as the vehicle, a large pickup truck, slowed down and stopped behind me, grabbed my waterproof jacket from the passenger seat, and took a deep breath before opening the door. The wind almost ripped it out of my hands. The rain soaked my clothes in a matter of seconds. A figure emerged from the truck, hunched against the storm as it approached. I made out more details. It was a tall, sturdy man in a dark raincoat. And the hood down over his face. Car problems? He asked, raising his voice over the roar of the wind. I nodded, running my hand over my face to wipe the water from my eyes. The engine just died, I replied. He knows something about cars. He let out a low laugh, almost lost in the storm. Maybe he does. Open the hood, let's take a look. Grateful for the help, I ran back to my car and pulled the lever. By the time I got back out, he was already leaning over the engine, his flashlight illuminating the metal parts. It looks like your alternator is dead, he said after a few moments. It's not something we can fix here. My heart sank. Great, I murmured. Some chance he'll take me to the nearest town. I could call a crane from there. He straightened up, and for the first time I saw his face with clarity. Something in his gaze took me back a step. His eyes were cold, calculating, without the slightest hint of kindness. A silent warning echoed in my mind. Danger, of course, he said, in a voice suddenly lower. I can take you. Every instinct in my body. He shouted that I didn't try to force a smile, keeping my tone light, thinking it through. I think I'll wait here. The storm will pass soon. His hand closed on my arm with a force unexpected. I insist. My reaction was pure adrenaline. I broke free from his grip and took a step back. My foot slipped on the wet gravel and I fell backwards, the air escaping my lungs in a gasp. He leaned over me, his expression no longer pretense. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, he said, reaching out again. My hand moved before I could think of my fingers. They found a cold, wet rock on the ground. I threw it with all my might. The blow made him stagger, letting out a growl of pain. I jumped at the chance and ran not to my car but into the darkness of the boss, away from him and his truck. The rain was lashing my face almost as I could hear him behind me. His heavy footsteps splashing in the puddles was faster. He was catching up with me just as his hand brushed the back of my jacket. I threw myself off the road, rolled down the hill, the mud and the branches scratching my skin. I stopped in a dry blow, panting in pain. Ari, his voice echoed through the trees. You can't run forever. But it didn't move. I had gotten lost in the darkness. Gathering strength, I stood up and groped my way forward. The shadows of the forest were dense, the roar of the storm muffling all sound. Every crack of a branch made me hold my breath. Then I saw something that gave me back hope. A cave. Without a second thought I went inside. The silence was overwhelming compared to the storm outside. I leaned against the cold stone wall, trying to catch my breath. The minutes passed slowly. Then the echo of footsteps at the entrance of the cave paralyzed me. A flashlight illuminated the darkness. I know you're here. His voice reverberating against the rocky walls. Come on. No, this harder. Fear immobilized me. I had no way out. I had nowhere to run. My only option was to fight. My fingers closed. They closed around a rock on the floor of the cave. I waited for the light. It came closer. The more I attacked with a desperate cry. I hit with all my might. The lantern fell to the ground. He staggered backwards, his growling in pain bouncing off the walls of the cave. I didn't stop to see if he recovered. I ran outside. The storm was starting to subside, and in the distance I saw lights, not from a flashlight, not from his truck. Sirens. A convoy of police cars was approaching down the road. With the last breath of energy I had left, I ran towards them, waving my arms frantically. The first car braked sharply. An officer, his hand came out on his gun. It's okay, miss. The adrenaline finally left me. My knees gave way and I collapsed. I whispered. He tried. I couldn't finish the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. The police found him unconscious in the cave. It turned out to be a serial killer wanted in 3 states. He had escaped being his next victim. The nightmares lasted for months, but over time I learned to see what I had won. I survived. I fought when it mattered most. Now when I take road trips I'm prepared, and when I see a car stranded on a dark road I don't stop, I just call the police. 'Cause now I know the truth. Sometimes the monsters aren't in the dark, sometimes they're the ones offering help. On a stormy night, the blast of a distant shot froze me dry in the dense, foggy forest of the Pacific Northwest. That sound had no place. My solo hiking trip, that was supposed to be a peaceful getaway to nature, had just taken a sinister turn. I stood motionless, holding my breath, straining my ear for any other sound. The voice that had been left in a sepulchral silence, as if all wildlife had also felt the intrusion. My heart pounded against my ribs, every beat rumbling in the silence. After what seemed like an eternity, I heard voices, harsh and angry voices, too far away to understand the words, but close enough to send a shiver down my spine. This was bear territory. Yes, but something told me that these weren't just hunters looking for prey. I adjusted the strap of my backpack, their familiar weight proving strangely comforting, and cautiously advanced the rational part of my brain, screaming that turn around, get as far away from those voices as possible. But curiosity, that human quality, drove me to keep going. The fog clung to the mossy trees, limiting visibility and muffling the sounds. I walked carefully over gnarled roots and wet leaves, thanking the soft sole of my hiking boots. As I got closer, the voices became clearer. "I told you to aim for the idiot," head growled. "One man isn't my fault," protested another. The thing moved at the last second. I ducked behind a fallen log, its decaying wood, providing us with a view to three men dressed in camouflage clothing carrying high-caliber rifles. But it wasn't their weapons that made my blood run cold. It was what lay at their feet. A tiger, a damn tiger, its orange and black fur contrasting brutally with the forest floor. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. My mind staggered. The tigers weren't native to these forests, devils. They weren't even native to this continent. The pieces fit together with nauseating clarity. These weren't hunters, they were poachers, and I just stumbled upon their illegal hunting of exotic animals. I had to have made some noise, a gasp or the rustling of a leaf, because suddenly one of the men turned his rifle sharply to his feet. "Who is there?" barked. "Show yourself." Crush me against the damp earth, my heart beating so hard that I feared that the sweatperlabb.com would hear it. When I opened them again, the poachers were dragging the corpse, leaving a trail of blood in its path. I waited until their voices faded before I dared to move. My legs were shaking as I stood up, adrenaline rushing through my veins. I needed to get out of there, alert the authorities. But when I turned to go back the way I had come, a branch broke behind me. Well, no. What do we have here? I turned suddenly and found myself face to face with a fourth poacher, his rifle pointed directly at my chest. His weathered face split into a yellowish smile. "It looks like we have a little spy," boys called. The other three emerged from the fog, their expressions a mixture of anger and cruel amusement. I raised my hand slowly, my mouth dry as sawdust. I didn't see anything, I just bambled a hiker. I missed the leader, a big man with a scar across his cheek, took a step forward. "Oh, I think you saw quite a bit," growled. "The question is, what are we going to do with you?" The others muttered to each other, throwing me sideways glances. I caught fragments of their discussion, whether they should kill me immediately or use me for something else. My mind worked frantically, looking for a way out of this nightmare. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice firm, "I don't want trouble. Just let me go, and I swear I won't say anything to anyone." The man with the scar let out a raspy laugh that echoed through the trees. "Oh, we know you won't say anything," he replied coldly, "because you're coming with us." Before I could react, two of them held me by the arms, their grips like iron pincers, dragged me deeper into the woods, away from the path of any hope of as we went along. The leader explained his operation to me with disgusting pride. They captured exotic animals from zoos and private collections, brought them to these remote forests, and sold hunts to wealthy customers who wanted to kill rare trophies. "And now," he said, fixing his cold gaze on mine, "you're going to help us catch the next prize." We came to a clearing where an old ramshackle pickup truck was parked in the back, caged a snow leopard, their eyes wide open with fear. The sight turned my stomach. They tied my hands and threw me into the cab of the truck. As we drove along overgrown logging roads, my mind was working at full speed. I had to find a way to escape. I had to save myself, and somehow I had to stop them. The hours passed as the forest turned denser and daylight was beginning to fade. Finally, the van pulled up in front of a ramshackle cabin in the middle of nothingness. They threw me out of the vehicle and pushed me into the cabin that reeked of damp and stale cigarettes. "Rest a bit," sneered the scar man. "Tomorrow you're going to help us set traps." They locked me in a tiny room, little more than a closet. Through the thin walls I could hear their voices as they drank and laughed, celebrating their successful hunt. I dropped to the floor, feeling trapped in a nightmare, no escape. But then, in the gloom, I noticed something. A small, tall window in the wall was too small for them to bother blocking it, but perhaps big enough for me to sneak away. I waited patiently as their voices grew more slurred and the laughter turned. When I was sure they were sleeping, I stood up cautiously, stretching until I reached the window. It was stuck, but with effort I managed to loosen every creak of the rotten wood. It made me hold my breath. Finally it hit me. I pushed myself up. My muscles trembled with the effort. For a moment I thought I had got stuck, but with one last push I managed to slide and fall to the forest floor. I got on my feet. I stood and ran. I ran like never before in my life, not daring to look back. The branches scratched my face and the roots threatened to trip me up, but fear kept me moving. I didn't know which direction I was going. I just had to get away from them. The forest was an impenetrable blackness, but the distant sound of the water gave me hope. A river, if I could find and follow it, maybe my breathing would find help. It was a breathy gasp as I finally broke the tree line and saw the water rushing before me. The sheer joy of finding something that could guide me almost made me cry. I followed the shore, my hurried but steadier step. With each passing minute, the sky was beginning to clear with the first shades of dawn, and then I finally saw what I needed so badly. A road wasn't big, but it was civilization I darted towards. My body trembled with exhaustion when a car appeared in the distance. I raised an arm and prayed for it to stop. To my amazement, the first vehicle braked. It was an elderly couple. Her eyes widened, seeing my disheveled appearance. "You are fine, son?" asked the man with genuine concern. I shook my head with a broken voice. "I don't need help. Please call the police." They didn't ask questions. They just helped me to get in the car, and they took me directly to the nearest police station. The next few days were a whirlwind of statements and search operations. Local police and federal authorities raided the cabin, but the poachers had already disappeared. However, the evidence they left behind was overwhelming. They not only found remains of skins and illegal traps, but also documentation that revealed a larger network of animal trafficking. Weeks later, I received a call. They were caught. The 4 men were arrested while trying to cross the border with Canada with several exotic animals in cages. The relief that you were able to do was indescribable. I hung up the phone and looked out the window. Since I was a child, the forest had always been my refuge, a place of peace and freedom. But now I had seen its darker side and understood that I needed protection. From that day on, I decided that not only I would not return to the forest, but I would fight for it. The next time I entered those paths, I would not do it alone, and I would certainly be better prepared for what I might find in those gloomy depths. The forest had shown me its most dangerous side, but it had also shown me my own strength, and that was a trophy far more valuable than any those poachers could have wanted. The crunch of the gravel under my boots were the only thing that broke the silence of the night. As I crossed the empty Ionation, there was something unsettling about the way the fog hung over the pavement, shrouding the abandoned cars in a spectral veil. I stopped in front of the door of the convenience store, the fluorescent glow inside casting a dim light on the deserted road. I just needed gas and a coffee to keep me awake in my long drive back home. But as soon as I pushed the door open and the bell rang in the stale air, I knew something wasn't right behind the counter. The cashier, a pale, thin man with dark circles under his eyes, stared at me with eyes too wide, too alert, didn't say anything when I walked in. Not a greeting, not a nod. He just watched me as I walked to the coffee machine. The silence was dense, stifling. Fridges buzzed in the back of the shelves, surprisingly well stocked for a store in the middle of nowhere. But there was no one else, no other customers, no sound of traffic on the road. A creep creeping down my spine as I poured the coffee into a disposable cup. Something wasn't right. I decided to pay fast and get out of there. When I got to the counter, the cashier was still watching me. "How much is it?" I asked, trying to ignore his intense gaze. He didn't respond immediately. Then in a low, tense voice, he said something that made my blood run cold. "Don't turn around." My fingers tensed over the hot glass. "Sorry." The cashier swallowed hard without taking his eyes off something behind me. "Listen to me well," whispered his now almost sickly white face. "Don't turn around. No matter what you hear. Just walk slowly towards the door and get out of here." My heart pounded in my chest. Every instinct in my body screamed to look, to check what was lurking behind me. But the fear in the cashier's eyes was real, too real. I did as he told me. Put the money on the counter with trembling hands, and without looking back, I started walking towards the door. I had barely taken a step when something changed in the atmosphere of the store. The air became dense, as if the very space around me was bending in on itself. A low, guttural sound vibrated in my ears. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Neither human nor animal, anything else. The cashier choked a dull, "Keep walking," whispered with desire. "Please." My legs felt like lead, each step harder than the last. Another noise, this time a harsh whisper, almost as if the air was being sucked out of the store. An icy chill ran down my spine. The door was just a few meters away. Another one step more. Something creaked behind me like bones bending at impossible angles. I bit my lip to keep from screaming. The doorbell rang when I pushed it, going out into the cold night air. But I didn't stop. I ran. I drove to my car, adrenaline clouding all my thoughts. The keys slipped on my sweaty fingers, but I managed to get them into the lock, threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, I saw the silhouette of the cashier inside the store. He was still standing behind the counter, his eyes bulging fixed on me, and then behind him a tall, crooked shadow, with limbs that were lengthened and twisted in ways that they defied logic. I didn't wait to see more. I started the car and shot out of the parking lot, my hands clutching the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tied to reality. No, I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if that was following me. I just drove mile after mile until the lights of the next city appeared on the horizon. I don't know how long it was before my pulse went back to normality. When I finally stopped in another town to rest, I checked my phone. There was no signal. I tried to look on the map for the store where I'd been. Nothing. Didn't show up in one part, like it never existed. Like everything never happened. But even today, on the darkest nights when the silence is too deep and the air feels too heavy, sometimes I hear that crack in my ears like bones bending at impossible angles, and I know that whatever I saw that night is still out there waiting. The first time I saw it, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A fleeting shadow at the edge of my vision, disappearing as soon as I turned my head to look. But when the sun began to sink below the tree line, casting long shadows on the forest floor, I realized with a growing horror that what lurked in the wild was all too real. I've always been a passionate nature photographer, spending weekends and vacations scouring remote areas in search of the perfect shot. This particular trip had been a success. It had taken me to the heart of the Pacific Northwest, to a stretch of primeval forest where few humans had ever set foot. In the image of the world, of a truly unexplored landscape, it was too tempting to resist. The first 2 days were peaceful, although challenging. The terrain was rugged, the undergrowth dense, and I had to constantly watch where I stepped to avoid a sprain or worse. But the scenery was breathtaking. Centuries-old Douglas cedars and firs towered above me, their branches covered in hanging moss. Rays of sunlight pierced the canopy, illuminating the forest floor with patterns. I had taken some amazing photos. A family of deer drinking from a crystal-clear stream, an owl watching me from the top of a gnarled oak tree, even a black bear wandering through a sun-drenched clearing. As the second day drew to a close, I was satisfied with my accomplishments. I camped in a small clearing, pitched my tent, and lit a campfire while I reviewed the day's photos on my camera. I had the strange feeling that someone or something was watching me. I looked up and scanned the tree line, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling persisted. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I shrugged my shoulders, attributing them to my overactive imagination. After spending so many hours alone in nature, I went to bed early, hoping to get up before dawn to take advantage of the morning light. I woke up before as the sun rose. The forest was still shrouded in darkness. As I walked out of my tent, a movement caught my attention. Something big slipped between two trees on the edge of the clearing. My heart rate accelerated. A bear, a puma. I grabbed my camera hoping to catch an image of anything. But when I looked through the viewfinder, a chill ran down my spine. There, barely visible in the dim, there was a figure whose shape defied explanation. It was vaguely humanoid, but too tall and thin. Its eyes 2 points of reflected light that seemed to pass through me. I lowered the camera slowly, my mouth dry. The figure had disappeared. It had vanished into the thick of the forest without making a sound. I stood there for a long moment, my mind entangled in unanswered questions. What the hell I had seen? A part of me wanted to pack immediately and get out of there. I didn't look back. But the other part, the same one that had become a nature photographer in the first place, I was intrigued. If this was an undiscovered species, having photographic evidence would be the find of a lifetime. Against my best judgment, I decided to keep going, pack on high alert. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. During the morning, I caught glimpses of something, a fleeting movement on my periphery, a shadow that seemed to move against the wind. Once I heard what sounded like heavy breathing, too close for my comfort. Every time I turned quickly, camera in hand, I never managed to capture more than nothingness. As the day progressed, my initial curiosity gave way to a growing feeling of fear. This was not just any animal. Its movements were too deliberate, too calculated. I was stalking was guiding me deeper and deeper into the wilderness for the afternoon. A sinking feeling in my stomach made me realize the hard truth. I was completely lost in my attempt to catch the being with my camera. I had left the planned trail. Now the trees looked identical, and the landmarks I had been using to orient myself were unknown. I tried to use the sun to orient myself, but the canopy made it almost impossible. The GPS had no signal. My phone had stopped working hours ago. I was alone. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and from none at once. I turned round, my heart beating against my ribcage, and there it was, standing on the edge of a small clearing, half hidden behind a fallen log, now in the waning light. In the afternoon I could see him clearly. He was at least 8 feet tall, his body covered in an irregular patch of skin and what appeared to be scales. His arms were too long, hanging almost to the ground, ending in sharp claws, but his face would haunt me in my nightmares for years. He was almost human, but distorted in a way that made my skin stand on end. His eyes were too big, too smart, and his mouth was full of rows and rows of needle-sharp teeth. We stared at each other. For what seemed like an eternity, my instinct was to lift my camera, my hands shaking. The shutter clicked, an absurdly loud sound in the tense silence that seemed to break the spell. The creature let out a roar that shook the trees and lunged at me. I didn't think. I just ran. I crashed into the brush, the branches scratching my face, the roots threatening to make me fall. I could hear it behind me. It was moving with a speed impossible for something its size. My lungs were burning, my legs were protesting, but terror was driving me forward. I ran aimlessly, without thinking, until suddenly, at the edge of a ravine, the water was roaring far below. There was nowhere to run. I turned around, facing into the darkness of the forest. For a moment I just heard my own gasping breath, and then slowly the creature emerged from the trees, its eyes boring into me with a predatory gaze. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that this was the end, but then something changed. The being stopped, looked beyond me to something in the water, and for the first time I saw something like fear in its eyes the moment I saw the footprints surrounding my tent. I knew that my solo camping trip had taken a sinister turn. My blood ran cold as I realized that someone or something had been putting me to sleep. The wilderness I had sought to find tranquility had now become a home ground. I have always loved hiking and camping, but this was my first time venturing only for an extended period. My job in the city was stressful, and I needed to disconnect from the world, spend a week in nature away from the noise and responsibilities. Sounds like the perfect getaway. The first days were idyllic. I walked through meadows full of wildflowers. I watched bison graze in the distance, and there was even a bear fishing in a crystal clear stream at night. I fell asleep to the distant howl of Los Lobos. Was exactly what I needed on the fourth night. Set up camp in a glotta by a bubbling creek. The place was perfect, surrounded by pine trees with an unobstructed view of the starry sky. Set up my tent, cooked a simple dinner, and settled into my sleeping bag, feeling more at peace than I had been in years. Woke up just before dawn with the morning chill seeping into my sleeping bag. Something felt strange, although at first I couldn't identify what it was. Then I realized the forest was in an absolute. There were no bird songs or the rustling of little animals in the undergrowth, only a suffocating silence that seemed to press from all directions, slide and stick my head out. The gloom of dawn revealed a scene that made my stomach shrink, indicating that whoever had left them was heavy, had been here standing around me while I slept. My backpack that I had left leaning against a tree was open. Its contents were scattered on the ground as if someone had been looking for something. Some things were missing. My first aid kit and my spare knife. With trembling hands I reached for my phone with no signal. I was miles from the nearest ranger station. I was alone, packing, eyes constantly scanning the trees, waiting to see a figure emerge from the shadows. As I rolled up my sleeping bag, something else caught my attention. Long dark hair resting on my pillow. It wasn't mine. Someone had been inside my tent while I slept. Panic threatened to overwhelm, but I pushed it down. I needed to stay calm, think rationally, get out of there. But in which direction? I took out my compass and held it in my hand. This one I needed to head to get to the main trail. I put on my backpack and started walking at a fast pace, looking back constantly at the forest, no longer feeling cozy but suffocating. The shadows seemed to move at the edges of my vision. Any rustling of branches made me jump. I had been walking for an hour when I heard it, a soft whistle, 2 long notes coming from somewhere behind me. It was not a bird, although the wind was clearly human. I started running. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see who or what was following me. The ground started to tilt in my haste. I didn't realize I was approaching a steep slope. The ground disappeared beneath my feet. I fell rolling downhill, hitting rocks and roots before crashing into the ground at the bottom. Pain in my leg, a sprain or worse, a fracture. I looked up terrified of what I could see at the edge of the ravine. There was a tall, broad-shouldered man standing on top staring at me. My heart stopped. "What do you want?" My voice cracked with fear and adrenaline didn't respond. He just raised a hand to his mouth and whistled that same low tone and chilling. Then he turned and disappeared among the trees. I sat there for a moment, my mind spinning with questions. Who was he? What did he want? Why didn't he attack me? The sound of the water caught my attention. A stream ran a few meters from where I had fallen. Where there is a creek, there is a path. Limping, I used a branch as a stick and followed the water. Every step was a torment. But the fear I was propelled after hours of agonizing walking. I heard something that made me cry with relief, voices. I staggered out of the forest and I met a group of hikers. They looked at me in amazement. It must be a mess, covered in dirt, bloodied and with eyes bulging. With terror. "Help," I whispered. Someone was following me. The next few days were a whirlwind of between with rangers and doctors checking my wounds. No one found any trace of my pursuer. Some said he was a homeless man living in the forest. Others that maybe I imagined everything because of the stress and fatigue. But I know it was real because weeks later, when I opened the door of my house, one morning I found a small package on my step, without a return address. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was my first aid knife, and a single pine cone tied to it, a hair long and dark. Fear washed over me in a paralyzing wave, and then, in the morning breeze, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, a whistle, 2 low, soft notes. The hunt wasn't over. The cabin was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place to escape the chaos of the city and find inspiration for my next novel. Instead it became my prison, with danger lurking right beyond the tree line. I never imagined that a quiet vacation could turn into a fight for survival, but as I huddled in the darkness listening to the footsteps surrounding the outside, I knew how quickly paradise could turn into a nightmare. It all started 3 days ago. I had rented a small cabin in the middle of the forest, miles from the nearest town. The isolation was exactly what I needed to overcome my life. Writer's block, no distractions, no responsibilities, just my laptop and nature. The first 2 days were perfect. I woke up to birdsong I wrote on the porch in the mornings and took long walks in the afternoon. Words flowed easily in this environment. My characters came to life like never before. On the 3rd day, everything changed. I was writing when I noticed movement among the trees. At first I thought I was a servant or some other animal. But when I looked up I found eyes fixed on mine. A man was standing at the edge of the clearing. He was too far away to make out details, but something in his posture put me on alert. I raised a hand in greeting, thinking that maybe it was a hiker who had strayed from the trail. He didn't respond, he didn't move, he just watched me. After a few awkward seconds he turned around and disappeared among the trees. I tried to shake off my uneasiness and go back to my work, but I couldn't stop looking at where I had seen him throughout the day. I kept catching glimpses of his figure among the trunks, sometimes at the edge of the clearing, sometimes hidden in the shadows, always looking at me for the night. My nerves were shattered. Checked all the locks and I drew the curtains. I didn't sleep. Every creak from the old cabin, every whisper of the wind made me sit upright on the bed with my heart hammering in my chest. When dawn came I made a decision. This retreat had been hastily finished, packed, and I went out to my car determined to lengthen myself. But when I arrived my stomach sank, my tires were smashed, cut until they were useless, my breathing became shallow while fear enveloped me. This was not a coincidence. Someone had done it. Someone wanted me to stay here. I ran back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and securing the lock. There was no landline. I checked my cell phone with no signal. It wasn't unusual in such a remote place, but now it felt like a death sentence. I walked back and forth trying to think. I had food for a few days. But then what would someone come to get me when I didn't? The checkout, or my stalker would make his move. Before that happened, a knock on the door took me out of my thoughts. My blood froze. "Hello," called a male voice. "There is someone at home." My car broke down on the road, and your help. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to respond. "I can see you in there," continued the voice, now with a harder tone. "Why don't you open the door and we talk?" I backed away slowly, looking for something to defend myself with. My eyes found the poker in the fireplace. I grabbed it tightly, the cold metal in my sweaty hands. The man banged on the door harder. "Open this door." I escaped into the room and pushed a piece of furniture against the door. The window was my only way out. I tried to open it, but it was stuck from years of lack of use. I had no choice. I grabbed the poker and I hit the glass with all my might. It became sad with a thunderous crack. I heard hurried footsteps in the living room. There was no time. I threw myself out of the window, ignoring the cuts on my arms and pie. As I went through the broken glass, I fell to the ground with a sharp blow and got up immediately. I ran. The trees passed like blurred shadows around me. Fear drove me back. I heard a roar of frustration. "No, you're going to get far." I didn't stop. I didn't know how long I'd been running when my body started to give out. My legs were burning. My lungs were crying out for air. I knew I had to go on, but in which direction was I lost? Running right out of the cabin meant running straight into danger. The sun was slowly sliding across the sky. It was getting dark. I couldn't stay in the woods all night then. I heard it, the sound of the water running a river. If I could follow it downstream, maybe I'd find help. I headed towards the sound, hoping my stalker hadn't had the same idea. When I got to the shore, I knelt down, but something across the water made me stop. A cabin, not a ranger station. Hope burst into my chest. I ran to her, banged on the door hard. "Please help." A tall man in uniform rangers opened the door with an expression of alarm. "Miss, what happened?" The words spilled out in a whirlwind of despair. He didn't hesitate for a second, closed the door behind me, blocked the entrances, and called the police. The officers arrived in less than an hour. They searched for the man, but he was already missing. They found no traces of him, but they did find other people who had been in the cabin before him. People who never came back that night. As I sat in the police station wrapped in a blanket and with a hot cup of coffee in my hands, I knew I had been lucky. I could have been one more on the missing list. I finished my novel, became a bestseller, maybe because every word was real. I still love nature. I still look for quiet places to write, but I don't travel anymore. I trust my instinct alone, and always, because I learned the hard way that predators don't always have fangs and claws. Sometimes they use a smile and knock on your door asking for help. The whisper was so faint that I almost convinced myself that I had imagined it. But as I stood motionless in the corridor of the huge mansion I was guarding, I heard it again, a muffled voice coming from a wing that was, I assumed it was empty at the time. I realized I wasn't as lonely as I thought I was. When my college classmate Alexis asked me to take care of her house while her family was on vacation in Europe. For a month I accepted without hesitation. The Harrington estate was legendary in our small town. A Victorian mansion surrounded by acres of meticulously manicured gardens for a penniless graduate student like me. A month into that luxury, it sounded like paradise. The first week was everything I dreamed of. I swam in the Olympic-sized pool, devoured series on the huge screen of the home theater, and slept in a bed so comfortable I never wanted to leave it. I had been explicitly told that the East Wing was out of bounds, something about ongoing renovations, but the rest of the house was mine to explore. It was on the 8th night when things started to feel weird. I was up late working on my thesis in the library when I heard what appeared to be footsteps upstairs. I froze, my fingers suspended over my laptop keyboard. The house was old. Reason old houses make noises, but as I listened, I would swear I heard a door open and close. I shook my head, blaming my overactive imagination fueled by too much coffee and too little sleep. But in the days that followed, strange incidents multiplied. Objects in the kitchen were not where I had left them. I found lights on in rooms I was sure I had turned off, and I always had the feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to rationalize. Maybe I was more forgetful than I thought. Maybe the house had some automated system that I wasn't aware of. But deep down a part of me knew something wasn't right. It all came to a head that night. I had been tossing and turning. Unable to shake the restlessness that had been building up for days, I finally decided to get up and make myself a cup of tea in hopes of calming my nerves. I went down the big staircase, my bare feet sliding on the soft carpet. It was then that I heard a whisper so faint that I almost missed it. It came from the East Wing. I was paralyzed. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding too loud in the silent house. None response. Against all instinct, I found myself moving toward the sound. The entrance to the East Wing loomed in front of me. The corridor beyond plunged into impenetrable darkness. I stopped at the threshold, remembering Alexis's warning not to enter. But curiosity, that human need to know, pushed me forward. I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The light one cut through the gloom, illuminating a long corridor lined with closed doors. Specks of dust danced in the air, indicating that this part of the house had been inactive for a long time. I advanced slowly, with all my senses on high alert. The floorboards creaked under my feet, the sound amplified in the tense silence. I was in the middle of the hallway, when I heard it again, a murmur, a conversation in a low voice coming from behind one of the doors. My hand trembled at the approaching the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run to the safety of my room and pretend that it had all been a bad dream. But I had to know. I turned the knob slowly, shuddering that I saw made my blood freeze. What could once have been a bedroom had been transformed into a makeshift living space, a mattress on the floor surrounded by empty food containers and worn clothes. But it was the wall that caught my attention. It was covered in photographs, hundreds of them, and in each one of them I was. There I was, swimming in the pool, there having breakfast in the kitchen, working in the library, sleeping in my bed. Someone had been watching me, documenting my every move for who knows how long. A creak of wood behind me. I turned all the time. From my flashlight, landing on a figure in the doorway, a scruffy, blind-eyed man stared at me for a moment. We both froze, caught in a scene of mutual disbelief. Then he lunged at me. I reacted by pure instinct, banging the door in his face. I heard how he bumped into it as I spun and ran with my heart beating so fast I felt like it would burst in my chest. I ran down the hallway, not daring to look back. I could hear his footsteps behind me, heavy and accelerated. When I reached the main part of the house, I turned towards the front door. But when I grabbed the handle, I felt a knot of terror in my stomach. It was locked, and the key was in my room. I changed direction and ran to the kitchen. I could hear him approaching, his rough breathing echoing in the immense hall. I pushed open the kitchen doors, and my gaze swept around the place, looking for a weapon, anything. My sight stopped on the block of knives. I grabbed the biggest one just as he walked in the moonlight coming through the windows. I could see him with clarity for the first time. He was younger than I expected, perhaps in the late seasons, with long unkempt hair and an irregular beard. His big, bulging eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin stand on end. "You weren't supposed to find me," he said hoarsely. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this." My breathing was erratic. "Who are you?" I asked, holding the knife between us. He bowed his head with a crooked smile. "Alexander Harrington, Alexis's forgotten brother, the one his family had tried to erase from history." The truth was that it fell on me like a bucket of cold water. He had never left. He had always been there watching me, waiting for me. The house that I thought was empty never really was. The moment I heard the thud echoing through the empty mall, I knew that this night shift was about to become anything but ordinary. As the only security guard patrolling the vast, dark halls was used to the occasional noises, the creaking of the walls as they settled, the hum of the machines, the scurrying of some lost mouse. But this was different. This was human. I had been working at the Westfield Mall for 6 months, and the night shift had become routine, clocking in at 10 p.m., making my rounds, monitoring the security cameras, clocking in at 6 a.m. Repeating was not an exciting job, but I paid the bills and enjoyed the solitude. The night started like any other. I arrived while the last cleaning crew left, and I exchanged glances with Maria, the head of maintenance, who was rushing to take her bus. My first round was calm. I checked that all the shops were closed, that no mannequin had fallen. It happens more than one would think, and that there were no teenagers hiding for a night adventure. Everything seemed normal. The large atrium was silent, the fountain turned off, and the emergency lights casting a dim glow. I settled into the tiny security office, a room crowded with monitors showing images from the multiple cameras scattered around the mall. It was then that I heard it at first. I thought I had imagined it. I turned down the volume of the TV I used to have background noise, and listened attentively. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then there was again a thud, followed by what looked like murmuring voices. My heart began to beat faster as I scanned the screens for any movement. The mall had over 100 cameras, but they didn't cover every corner. The sound had to come from one of the blind spots. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, making sure the panic button on my belt. I knew from experience that I must always be prepared for the worst. The noise seemed to come from the wing near the jewelry stores. I moved silently, my muffled footsteps across the carpet in the hallway. As I got closer, the voices became clearer. 2, perhaps 3 people, speaking in urgent whispers. I turned a corner and stopped in secco, about 15 yards away. There were 3 figures dressed in black, grouped in front of the entrance of Cartier. One was pulling the lock while the other 2 kept watch. My mouth dried instantly. These were not teenagers making mischief. They were professionals, and they were armed. I could clearly see the silhouette of a gun on the hip of one of them. I slowly backed away, my mind working at full speed. I needed to call the police. but I knew it would take at least 10 minutes to arrive, and to then the thieves might have disappeared. I made a decision. I couldn't stop them, but I could slow them down and collect evidence. I turned off my radio to prevent some accidental noise from giving me away, and I crept forward, hiding behind pots and benches. I took out my phone and started recording, focusing on it clearly. When they turned their heads, finally the lock clicked with a soft click and the three men entered the store. I got close enough to hearing what was happening inside. The sound of glass breaking made me shudder. They were smashing the display cases. I knew I was taking a big risk, but I needed to see more. I poked my head out of the doorway with the phone still recording. What I saw made my blood freeze. The three men were methodically emptying the display cases, filling bags with watches and jewelry. But it wasn't that horrified me. It was the fourth body. In the room, Jerry, the guard who worked the previous shift, was lying on the floor with a pool of blood spreading under his head. I must have made some noise because one of the men looked up and our eyes met for an eternal second. We both froze. Then it all happened at once. "We have company," he screamed, pulling out his gun. I ran. I could hear his heavy footsteps behind me while my breathing was speeding up. I needed to find a place to hide and buy time until help arrived. I turned a corner and pulled into a service hallway, trying to stay calm as I turned on my radio and pressed the panic button. I didn't dare to speak, fearing that my voice would reveal my location. The hallway led to the food court. I threw myself behind the counter of a closed pizzeria and I could control my breath. I could hear the men coming into the area. Their voices, low and menacing. "Come out, Salt, where you can see yourself." I hum one with a mocking tone. "We just want to talk." I held my breath, shrinking. At least there would be evidence. A rumble made me jump. They were throwing tables, looking methodically. They wouldn't take long to find me. My eyes went around the kitchen looking for something to defend myself with. I saw a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. Wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. They took it down, careful, praying that it wouldn't make noise. The footsteps were approaching just as the shadow of one of them fell on the counter. I got up and unloaded a cloud of foam directly on his face. He backed away, cursing and rubbing his eyes. I took advantage of his bewilderment to jump the counter and run away. I could hear the screams behind me, but the element of surprise made me I had given the advantage. I ran to the escalators and went up 2 by 2. I needed more options, more stores to hide in, more time. I went into a department store and zigzagging between the shelves. I could hear them spreading out, looking for me. Then I remembered it, the security shutters. Each store had one. If I managed to get to the control panel, I could lock myself in. I advanced towards the main entrance. Half hidden behind a clothing display, I saw the middle panel. Hidden behind a shelf, type in the code and the shutter began to come down with a roar. The men screamed when they realized what I was doing. But it was too late. The shutter slammed shut, trapping them outside. A few minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police had arrived. The sound of sirens bounced off the walls of the mall, their echo vibrating on the floor. Clinging to my phone with my chest going up and down in frantic gasps, I knew that the nightmare was about to end. The 3 thieves were trapped on the other side of the security shutter. They were screaming and banging on the metal in frustration. But it didn't matter anymore. The police were here. A loud bang shook the mall as officers stormed through the main entrance, guns in hand. "Police, throw away your guns and get on the ground." From my hiding place inside the department store, I heard chaos break out. Orders shouted, furious curses, the sound of bodies being knocked to the ground and handcuffs securing with a snap. I walked out slowly with my hands up. An officer saw me and came over immediately. "It's you. The security guard is injured." I shook my head, even though my legs were shaking so much that I could barely stand. I'm saying, my voice breaking. Then they attacked Jerry. The officer's eyes hardened. "We found him. He's alive but badly wounded. He's being taken to the hospital right now." Immense relief ran through my body. Jerry had survived. The next few minutes passed in a whirlwind of red and blue lights, flashing interrogations, and officers moving quickly back and forth. I handed over my phone with the footage of the robbers in action, which gave the cops solid evidence of what finally happened. When the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky with golden and orange tones, they let me go. I walked out of the mall feeling the fresh morning air on my face. I knew that going back to work would not be easy. The dark corridors would no longer feel quiet, but full of menacing shadows. Every sound would make my heart beat hard, but I would face it because that night I had learned something about myself. When danger came, I didn't freeze. I didn't run away. I fought, and that was something that no thief could take away from me. The scream that echoed in the abandoned wing of the mental hospital froze my blood. Wasn't the typical wail of a distraught patient. This was something more primitive, more savage, and worst of all came very close. At that moment I knew my turn. Nighttime cleaning at Oakwood Psychiatric Hospital was about to become a fight for my life. I had been working as a janitor at the hospital for almost 2 years. The pay wasn't the best, but I liked the quiet of the night. Most of the time I could do my routine uninterrupted. With only occasional encounters with the nurses on duty or the quieter patients, I had become accustomed to the unsettling atmosphere of the building and to the echo of my own footsteps in the empty hallways. That night began like any other. I clocked in at 11 p.m., exchanged a few words with the day shift staff as they left, and got to work, cleaning the floors, disinfecting the bathrooms, emptying the trash, monotonous work that allowed me to let my mind wander. It was around 2 in the morning when I arrived at the East Wing. That part of the hospital had been closed for renovations for months, but we still had to do a night check to make sure that no patient had been sighted. When I arrived at the access door, I noticed something strange. The padlock that normally secured the entrance was missing. A shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to calm down. Probably the maintenance team had removed it for some reason and forgot to put it back in. Pushed the door open and entered. The rusting hinges squeaking echoed through the dark hallway. It was always unsettling in the East Wing with its peeling paint and abandoned medical furniture casting twisted shadows. But that night it felt different. The air was heavy, oppressive. There was a strange smell, a mixture of moisture, old disinfectant and something else, something I couldn't identify. But that I couldn't identify. I churned my stomach. I advanced slowly, shining my flashlight. Every corner of the hallway had reached halfway when I heard it, a thud like a shuffle coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hallway. I stopped in dry, heart pounding hard in my chest. Maybe a rat, I said to myself. Maybe just the wind. Hello, I called, my voice trembling more than I'd like to admit. There's someone there. Then a low, guttural growl. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but my legs didn't respond. Then I saw him. A figure emerged from the gloom. It was a tall man, too thin. He was wearing what seemed to be old hospital uniforms, now dirty and torn. But when my flashlight shone on his face, I felt my stomach contract. It wasn't a human face. His eyes were wide open, injected with blood, but his gaze was lost, as if he was seeing something beyond me. His mouth was an unnatural grimace. His lips cracked and retracted over yellowish teeth. But the worst thing was his hands. They were covered in dried blood. God, what the hell was this? The man blinked, and for a second he seemed to notice my presence. Then he opened his mouth and screamed, an inhuman shriek that bounced off the walls, filling the air with its distorted echo, and then ran towards me. I turned around and shot down the hallway. I didn't think. I wasn't looking back. I just ran. I could hear their footsteps behind me, fast and erratic. My breathing was a frantic gasp. As I approached the exit of the East Wing, I pushed the door with all my might and ran to the main hallway. Help, I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty hospital. Someone please. But the building was quiet. The administrative offices on this floor were empty. The nearest infirmary was 2 floors up. It was alone. I turned down a random hallway, trying to lose it, but I found myself in a dead end, cursed under my breath, desperately looking for a way out. There was a storage door a few meters away. I ran towards it and got inside. Just as he was turning the corner, I held my breath as I listened to his heavy breathing on the other side of the door. Then silence, seconds, minutes. I didn't know how much time passed. I finally plucked up the courage to open the door. Just a little bit. The hallway. I moved silently, gliding back to the main area of the hospital. The first thing I did was run to the infirmary and take the emergency phone. I dialed security with trembling fingers. "What's up?" replied a voice, drowsy. "There's someone in the wing." This I whispered. "He's not a patient. Something's wrong." It wasn't even 5 minutes before the guards arrived. They found no trace of him. But they found other things. Forced doors, broken stretchers, and worst of all, an open padded cell. Reports later confirmed it. Patient 37, an unidentified John D., admitted months ago for episodes of extreme violence and hallucinations, had been transferred to another psychiatric hospital 2 weeks before, or so it was supposed. No one knew how he had returned. But he was, of course, he had never left. I never went back to Hwood after that night. I couldn't. Even today I hear that scream in my dreams, and I wonder, is he really locked up this time, or is he still lurking in the dark waiting for another night shift to find his next victim? The moment I saw his eyes glowing in the dark, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. The motel owner's friendly attitude had been just a mask, and now in the middle of the night his true face was revealed as he hovered over my bed. I understood with terrifying clarity that this remote place on the road was not just a simple stop on the road, it was a trap. Everything had started in an ent way. I was on a road trip across the country trying to clear my mind after a disastrous breakup. The freedom of the open road, the changing landscape, everything was just what I needed to reboot and refocus my life. I had been driving for hours with the sun already gone on the horizon when I saw the neon sign flashing in the vacant darkness. The Pine Grove Motel was not a big deal. A single-story building with paint peeling and a gravel parking lot, but at that moment exhaustion weighed more than my standards. Any place with a bed would do. I turned into the driveway and stopped the car. The sound of tires on the gravel breaking the silence of the night. I walked to the office. A bell rang as I pushed open the door and a man appeared from a back room. He was older, probably in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and a bulging belly that gave away too many beers and dinners in front of the TV, but his smile was warm and his eyes wrinkled at the corners in a way that instantly put me at ease. "Welcome to Pine Grove," he said in a rough but friendly voice. "What can I help you with?" "I just need a room for the night," I replied, suppressing a yawn. "Not fancy." He nodded, turning to take a key from the wall behind him. "The room, yes, it's all yours. It's quiet, away from the road. You'll sleep like a baby." I thanked him. I paid cash. The card machine was broken, and I headed to the room. It was basic but clean, a double bed with a faded floral quilt, an old TV, probably with antenna, and a bathroom that, although old-fashioned, at least looked hygienic. I had no energy to do anything but take off my shoes and collapse into bed. I fell asleep as soon as my head touched the pillow. I don't know what woke me up. Maybe it was a noise or that primitive instinct that tells you when something is wrong. Suddenly I was wide awake, my heart pounding in my chest. For no apparent reason, the room was dark. I reached out to the bedside table to take my phone, but my fingers only found empty. Then I remembered I had left it charging in the car. I cursed my own stupidity and felt in the dark until I found the lamp switch. Nothing. The electricity was cut off. It was at that moment when I heard it, the soft creak of the floor somewhere in the room. I froze. It could be the building settling. Old motels make strange noises at night, but then I saw them. Two little bright spots in the darkness, at the height of a person standing. Eyes. Someone was in the room with me. I opened my mouth to scream, but a hand closed on her before I could make a sound. The eyes came closer, and in the half-light I could make out the face of the motel owner. The friendly expression had disappeared. In place, there was something cold. "Predator, don't make a noise," he whispered, his voice now just a harsh murmur. "Just relax and this will end quickly." The panic hit me like an icy wave. I challenged myself with all my might, trying to get out of his grip, but he was surprisingly strong for his age. With his free hand he searched for something on the bedside table, a metallic flash, a syringe. It was then that my survival instinct kicked in. Without thinking, I sank my teeth into the hand that was covering my mouth. He screamed in pain and surprise, his grip loosening enough for me to break free. I rolled out of bed, placing the bed between us. "See," growled, rage transforming his face, "you're just making it harder." My hands blindly searched for something to defend me. My fingers found the base of the bedside lamp. I ripped it off the wall and threw it with all my might. The blow resounded with a dull crack as the lamp hit his head. He staggered back, cursing. I didn't wait to see if he recovered. I ran to the door, struggling with the lock in the dark. I felt his hand closing on my ankle. I fell hard, my chin hitting the door frame. A metallic taste filled my mouth. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, dragging me back into the room. Kicked hard, my foot impacting against something soft. A gasp at his grip. It loosened. I jumped up and ran out. The cold night air hit me when I crossed the parking lot. The place was deserted, only my car and the owner's old truck. I ran to my car, praying that it was open. The handle went under my hand. Thank God. I jumped inside and closed the door just as he was emerging from the room, still wobbly, but with my face twisted from the go. My hands were shaking as I tried to get the key into the ignition. "You can't leave," he screamed, banging on the window with both hands. "You're mine." The engine roared when it started. I reversed and stepped on the accelerator. The tires spat gravel as I walked away. He tried to grab the door handle, but lost grip when I picked up speed. I didn't let go of the throttle until the sign, the Neon Motel, disappeared into the distance. My heart hammers in my chest. What the hell had just happened? I didn't stop until I saw the lights of a gas station at dawn. With trembling hands, I dialed 911. What followed was a whirlwind of interrogations, depositions, and medical checkups. I discovered that the Pine Grove motel had been the preserve of a serial killer's house. For years women had disappeared in that road, but they had never been able to connect the cases until now. In the following days, while I gave statements and pointed to the owner in a row of suspects, the reality of how close I was to death hit me. I survived, and thanks to me his reign of terror was over. I never set foot in a motel since then. But every night when I turn them off, I see those eyes in the darkness, and I wonder, how many more I don't live to tell their story. The moment I realized I was being stalked through the forest, my quiet hiking journey became a desperate struggle to survive. The dense foliage that once seemed welcoming and serene to me now felt like a natural prison with dangers lurking behind every shadow. I've always loved hiking. There's something about the vastness of nature that helps me to clear my mind. This time, I decided to challenge myself with a 3-day hike through the Adirondacks, a trail that had been on my bucket list for years. I prepared meticulously, making sure to bring everything I needed: enough food, a GPS, a compass, and my trusty knife. It wasn't my first solo hike, and while I respected the dangers of nature, I had never felt real fear in the wilderness. The forest until this trip. The first day was perfect. I walked at a good pace, enjoying the fresh air and the rustling of the leaves under my boots. I stopped to take pictures of the wildlife and to observe a servant drinking in a stream at dusk. I pitched my tent in a clearing next to a river, feeling at peace with the world. The second day was when things started to feel strange. The forest was too quiet. The usual sounds: birds chirping, squirrels scurrying, the rustle of the wind through the leaves had disappeared in their place. A silence reigned, heavy and unnatural. At first I thought that maybe a predator was nearby. Small animals tend to be quiet when there is a bear or a wolf prowling. But as I went along the path, I could not shake the feeling that someone was watching me. More than once I turned around, suddenly convinced that I had seen movement among the trees, but there was never anything there. Yet comfort grew in my chest like a stone. When I set up camp that night, I chose a site with good visibility, making sure there were no dense bushes or trees nearby where something or someone could hide. But that didn't stop what happened. I woke up in the dark, my body tense for no reason apparent. Then I heard it. Footsteps were not those of an animal. They were slow, from freed humans. My heart hit against my ribs while I was holding my breath. Someone was walking around my tent. Hello. My voice sounded weak, broken by fear. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. I squeezed my knife, waiting for something. After what seemed like hours, the footsteps slowly moved away, getting lost in the thicket. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally began to dye the sky orange, I left my tent cautiously. The dew covered the grass, revealing something that made panic rise through my throat, like bile. Footprints were large and surrounded completely my tent. Someone had been standing out there watching me sleep. Pax, Surad, I wasn't going to stay a minute longer than necessary. I decided to go back the same path I had taken. Come, even if it meant walking all day without rest. I had barely been walking for an hour when I saw him in a clearing about 100 meters away. A figure was standing among the trees. My mouth went dry. It was a tall man dressed in dark clothes. He was not moving. He was just watching me. When our eyes met, he raised a hand and waved, not a friendly greeting. It was a slow and calculated gesture, as if he were making it clear that he had been following me all along. Panic gave me a rush of adrenaline. I ran aimlessly without worrying about saving energy or following the path. I didn't mind getting lost. I just wanted to get away. I don't know how long I was running before I stopped to catch my breath. But when I looked back, he was still there, closer. This time my mind went into total panic. How he was moving so fast without making a sound. I forced myself to think I needed to get to a safe place, and then I heard it, the sound of water running, a river. If I could find it and follow, it would take me to a main road. With my last energy, I threw myself into the sound, making my way through the brush, no matter the cuts in my arms or the burning in my legs. When I finally saw the river, I knew I had a chance. But at the end of the day, I knew I had a chance. Peeking out to the shore, my stomach sank. The other side was a steep cliff. There was no way to cross on foot. My pursuer would arrive at any moment. I only had one choice. I got into the icy water and let the current drag me away. The impact was brutal. The waters were choppy, hitting me against the rocks. I sank several times, my lungs burning with the lack of air, but somehow I kept moving. When I finally managed to swim to the other shore, I collapsed, stones, cursed, and forced myself to look back. He was on the opposite bank, standing looking at me. He didn't do anything attempt to cross. He just stayed there. After a moment, He turned on his heels and disappeared among the trees. I followed the river for hours until I finally reached a small town. I could barely speak when I stumbled to the police station. The officer who attended me took my statement seriously. Patrols were sent to look for the man, but they found nothing. The traces on the ground had already been erased by there was no rain. There were no footprints, nothing. No one could explain it. Some said it was probably a hunter or a wanderer living in the forest, but deep down I knew the truth. He was there for me, and it wasn't the first time he did it. I returned home, but I never felt safe in the forest again. I tried. I wanted to recover my love for nature, to get lost again in its immensity. But every time I was alone among the trees, I couldn't help but remember that dark silhouette among the pines, and on the quietest nights when the wind blows hard against my window, sometimes I think I hear him again. That slow and calculated greeting, as if he were telling me, "Don't think I've forgotten you." The moment his hand closed around the steering wheel, I knew I'd made a fatal mistake. The soaked stranger, because of the rain I picked up on that lonely stretch of road. He wasn't a desperate traveler. He was a predator, and I had just invited him into my car. I've always considered myself a good judge of character. It's a skill I pride myself on, one that has served me well in my career as a peddler. But on that stormy night, as I drove down the winding mountain roads in Colorado, my instinct, on which normally never failed, betrayed me in the worst way. The day had started normally. I left Denver early with the intention of reaching Salt Lake City before dark. But as I ascended the Rocky Mountains, the weather abruptly changed. What started as a slight soon turned into a torrential downpour with curtains of water, reducing my visibility to just a few feet in front of me. I was supposed to have waited in one of the small towns I'd passed through, but I had an important meeting the next morning, one that could define my performance for the quarter. So I kept going, clutching the steering wheel with my white knuckles as I maneuvered through the dangerous curves. That's when I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road, his thumbs up. He was soaking wet, with his clothes clinging to his body, and head down against the rain. In the brief glare of my headlights, glimpsed middle-aged with a beard and a hopeless expression. When he saw me approaching, I hesitated to pick up hitchhikers. It's never safe, but the thought of leaving someone in that downpour didn't sit well with me either. Besides, I thought, I'm a big guy. If things get ugly, I can handle it. I turned onto the shoulder, the wet gravel crunching under the tires. The man ran to the passenger door, and I leaned down to unlock it. Thank you, he said as the water rose dripping from his clothes to the seat. His voice was harsh, almost muffled. I thought I was going to die out there. No problem, I replied, going back to the road. Where are you going? Only to the next town, he said, almost muttering. My truck broke down a few miles back. I need to find a mechanic. I nodded. You're lucky. I think there's a workshop about 20 kilometers ahead. I appreciate it, he said then, after a moment of silence. Hey, you have something to drink? I'm dry inside. Of course, I replied, taking the water bottle from my cup holder and extending it, and it was at that moment that everything changed. His hand he moved with an inhuman speed, but not towards the bottle, but towards the steering wheel. At the same time, I felt something cold and metallic pressing my ribs. A gun keeps driving, growled his tone, now completely different. And don't do any stupidity, my mind went on in panic, running through every fiber of my being. This wasn't happening. These things only happen in movies and crime news. But the barrel of the gun sinking into my side was real. I swallowed hard. Look, if it's money you want, I've got cash. It's in my jacket. Take it and get out. He laughed, a sound cold and moodless. Oh, I'm going to take your money, of course, but that's not all I want. A chill ran down my spine. What else did I want? The possibilities, each one scarier than the last, crowded into my mind. Take the next exit, he ordered, tilting the gun towards the road. In the distance I saw a sign indicating a detour to a dirt road. The darkness of the trees ahead, he said, everything I needed to know. If I got off the main road, I wouldn't get out of there alive. Listen, friend, I tried, keeping my voice steady. You don't have to do this. Leave me on the road, and you can take everything I have. His expression hardened. Take the exit. The car was getting closer and closer to the turnoff, and I knew I only had one chance. I let go of the steering wheel and hit the horn with all my might. The horn honked through the night like a desperate scream. The man jumped. His grip on the gun loosened for just a split second. It was all he needed. I grabbed his wrist and forged with the gun as the car kept moving forward. The gun went off. The rumble was deafening. Inside the vehicle, a searing burning spread through my left arm, but I didn't let go. In the midst of the chaos, my foot must have hit the accelerator because the car roared forward off the dirt road and back on the main road. In a last effort, I let go of his wrist and grabbed the steering wheel with both hands. I turned sharply. The car skidded, the tires skidding on the wet asphalt. The movement caused my attacker to crash into the passenger door. The impact was brutal. His head hit the glass with a dull crunch and the gun fell out of his hand. I didn't wait to see if he recovered. I pressed the accelerator, leaving the exit, and the man behind. I didn't brake until I saw patrol lights in the distance. Someone must have heard the shot or my honk and called the police. I stopped on the shoulder, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. The next couple of hours it was a whirlwind of question statements and an ambulance checking my arm. I discovered that my attacker was a criminal wanted in several states for kidnappings and murders on desolate roads. His modus operandi was always the same. He took advantage of storms and lonely roads to bring good Samaritans. Only this time I had chosen the wrong man. The detective who took my statement looked at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. Most people would have turned in the car without a fight, he commented. I shrugged my shoulders, feeling the twinge in my wounded arm. I don't know what happened. I admitted alone. I couldn't let the policeman win, he nodded. Well, thanks to you. He won't be able to hurt anyone else anymore. A hero like that. They called me on the news the next day, but I didn't feel like a hero. I felt lucky. I had looked death in the eye, and I had managed to get out alive. Now when I drive on lonely roads, I keep the doors locked. I no longer pick up hitchhikers, but I also drive with a newfound certainty. No matter what happens, I know I have the strength to face any storm, because that night I not only survived, I won. The moment I saw the unmarked boat glide into the secluded cove, I knew that my quiet fishing trip had just turned into a struggle for survival. As I watched the men download mysterious boxes under the cover of the night, I understood that I was witnessing something I should never have seen, and that single idea could cost me my life. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. My job as a software developer in the city was rewarding, but the constant noise, deadlines, and pressure were starting to wear me down. I needed a break, a moment of peace away from the chaos, so I chose a remote site, a small corner of Lake Champlain, accessible only by boat or after a strenuous walk through the woods. It was not a tourist area, which meant I would have the entire cove to myself, just me, my fishing rod, and the calm sound of the water hitting the shore. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. I spent the time throwing my line into the water, drinking beer, and enjoying the absolute silence. I felt completely cut off from the world. No worries, no distractions. On the third night everything changed. I was dozing in my tent when a low, steady noise woke me up. At first I thought it was the distant sound of thunder, but as I listened more carefully I knew it was something different, the hum of an engine. I sat up quickly and poked my head out of the tent. The full moon lit up the surface of the lake with a silver glow, allowing me to see clearly what was approaching. A boat gliding in. The darkness with its lights off, a shiver ran down my spine. Why anyone would be sailing without lights? At this hour I stood completely motionless, watching as the boat reached the shore. 4 men jumped ashore, moving accurately and efficiently. They didn't talk much, but low whispers mingled with the sound of the water. I saw one of the boxes open, and what I saw inside made my stomach contract. Many weapons. My mind began to run. Who were these guys? Smugglers, drug traffickers, corrupt military? I didn't know, but I did know one thing for sure. If I was discovered, I wasn't going to get out of this alive. As carefully as possible, I slowly backed up to my store, trying not to make noise. I needed to get out of there, and my boat. I was on the shore, but starting the engine would make too much noise. I had to flee. Through the woods away. Feel before they noticed my presence, slip into my pocket, and I began to pick up my backpack when cracked, a dry sound like a branch splitting under my foot. I was paralyzed. The murmur of the men stopped, then a voice roared, "Who is there?" Panic exploded in my chest. I ran. I threw myself into the forest without thinking, pushing branches, tripping over roots behind me. Screams and the sound of hurried footsteps indicated that they were following gunshots. Bullets broke the silence of the night, whistling close to my head, smashing logs around me. My only option was to keep running, but I couldn't see anything. The forest was a maze of shadows and trees that seemed to close in on me. Suddenly the ground disappeared under my feet. Free fall, I rolled down a steep slope, hitting rocks and roots before crashing to the ground with an impact that it took my breath away. Pain in my side, my sprained ankle, but I couldn't stop. From the top of the slope, I heard one of the men scream. Look for him. He can't have gone very far. Limping, I got up and looked around, and then I saw a stream. If I followed the water, I had a chance of finding a way or a cabin. I didn't think twice. I got the ice water in. Ignoring the pain in my limbs as I trudged between the slippery rocks above the sound of the water, I heard more screams. They were looking for me. I forced myself to keep moving. The water was up to my waist when a new sound paralyzed me. Engine God, they had returned to the boat and were following me down the river. They knew I couldn't move so fast through the water. I hid behind some rocks, trembling, watching how the silhouette, the dark of the boat, was sliding downstream. One of the men leaned over the gunwale, scanning the shore with a flashlight. It must be close. It couldn't have vanished. I held my breath. The light of the flashlight passed over my hiding place. Endless seconds, and then the engine roared again. They were moving away. I didn't wait for them to change their minds. I got out of the water and kept running, ignoring the cold that penetrated to my bones. I don't know how much time passed, but finally I saw lights in the distance, a small town on the other side of the shore. The first house I found collapsed, banging on the door with all my might, until someone opened. My voice, it was like a desperate whisper. Please help me. The next few days were a blur of hospitals, interviews with the police, and sleepless nights. The agents took my statement, but when they returned to they didn't find anything. No boat, no boxes, no footprints, as if it had never happened. The authorities assured me to patrol the area, but deep down, I knew the truth. Those men were not amateurs. They knew exactly how to disappear without a trace. Since that night I have not camped again. Only the water before my refuge now fills me with a visceral fear, and every time I hear the distant roar of an engine at night, I remember the chill of the water, the feeling of being married, and I wonder if somewhere those men are still out there waiting for the next unfortunate person to see something he shouldn't see. The pungent smell of chemicals burned my nostrils, a brutal contrast to the fresh scent of celery that had surrounded us moments before. As I looked at the makeshift laboratory hidden in the woods, I realized that our peaceful family camping trip had turned into a struggle for survival. It was supposed to be a weekend of bonding and relaxation. My wife Sarah, our 2 children Emma 12 and Liam 9, and I had been planning this trip for months. We had found a secluded spot in the national forest away from the crowded campgrounds and noisy caravans, just us, the trees and the stars. On the first day, it was perfect. We set up the tent, walked the trails, and spent the night roasting marshmallows over the campfire. The kids were delighted to be away from their screens, excitedly pointing to the constellations in the night sky. On the second day, we decided to explore a little further away from our campsite. The forest was dense, sunlight filtering through the foliage in speckled patterns. Emma led the way with her innate sense of direction, much better than mine. Liam was behind, stopping every few meters to examine interesting stones or insects. We had been walking for an hour when I noticed something strange, a faint chemical smell that didn't fit with the natural environment. I exchanged a look with Sarah, seeing my own confusion reflected in her eyes. Maybe someone is camping nearby, she suggested. Although her tone was uncertain, I nodded, not wanting to alarm the children. Let's check it out. But let's stay together. As we went, the smell intensified through the trees. I spotted a clearing and my heart almost stopped. There, hidden in the woods, there was a makeshift methamphetamine lab. Tarps hung between the trees, forming a rudimentary shelter. Underneath you could see plastic containers, tubes, and other equipment that I didn't want to identify. The acrid was unbearable. I grabbed Emma's shoulder, stopping it. I whispered, trying to stay calm. We need to give. We turned back very slowly and returned to our camp, but before we could move, a voice boomed behind others. Well, what do we have here? A man emerged from behind one of the tarps, his eyes wild and full of suspicion. He was soon joined by 2 others, all with the same dangerous and unpredictable look. Sarah hugged the children tightly as I moved forward, raising my hands in a non-threatening gesture. We feel, I said with my mouth dry with fear. We were just hiking and we got lost. We'll leave right now. The first man, clearly the leader, shook his head. I can't let them do that, friend. They've seen too much. A chill ran down my spine. These men weren't going to let us go. I saw the calculation in their eyes, weighing options, and none of them ended well for my family. Listen, I said, trying to keep my voice firm. We don't want trouble. We won't say anything to anyone. Just let us go, and it will be as if we had never been here. The leader seemed to consider my proposal for a moment. Then, with a speed that belied his deteriorated appearance, he pulled a gun from his back. Sarah stifled a scream, and I heard Liam sob behind her. This is what's going to happen, said the man in a cold voice. They'll come with us, without screaming or screaming. Things are going to get very ugly, very quickly, they understand. I nodded with my mind racing. We were at a disadvantage and without weapons. Our only hope was to go along with them and look for an opportunity to escape. They guided us to their camp, the gun pointed directly at my chest. As we got closer, I saw more details of their operation. It was bigger than I had imagined, with several cooking stations installed. These men were not traffickers, it was a serious business. We were tied up, with plastic zip ties, squeezing their skin. Children were crying silently, and the pain in my heart was unbearable. Sarah looked at me with a pale face, but her eyes conveyed determination. I tried to give her back the same security. Although inside I was terrified. While the men argued about what to do with us, I analyzed our surroundings. The camp was chaotic, with equipment and supplies scattered everywhere. If we could cause a distraction, maybe we could escape. It was then that I saw them. The propane tanks were being used to power their portable stoves, but in the wrong hands, or in this case ours, they could be incredibly dangerous. I looked at Sarah and slid my gaze to the tanks. Her eyes opened slightly as I understood. My idea returned a small nod, almost imperceptible. Please, Sarah said with a trembling voice. My son, she needs her inhaler. It's in my backpack. The men turned to her, momentarily distracted. It wasn't much, but it was the opportunity we needed. I lunged forward, ignoring the pain as the zip ties dug into my wrists. I shouldered the nearest propane tank, knocked down the stove connection, came loose and began to whistle gas, which one of the men shouted, but I was already moving towards the next tank. Chaos broke out. The men rushed towards me, but Sarah had also sprang into action. She had managed to free a hand and was untying the children. Kick another tank and the air was filled with the pungent smell of gas. One of the men caught up with me and grabbed my arm. I wrecked, using his own momentum to make me lose my balance. Tripped and fell on a table full of chemicals, heard the sound of glass breaking and a worrying sizzio as the substances mixed. Run, I screamed at Sarah, and the children didn't need me to repeat them. I saw them disappear into the trees while I struggled with another of the men. Was stronger than me, driven by desperation and probably by the methamphetamine. His fist slammed into my jaw, sending me staggering. In my cloudy vision, I saw the leader raising his pistol. Is the end, I thought. At least Sarah and the children had escaped. But before I could pull the trigger, a deafening roar shook the air. One of the propane tanks had found a source of ignition. The explosion was deafening. The scorching heat threw me backwards against a tree, blowing the air out of my lungs. When I managed to get up, I saw the camp engulfed in flames. The men had disappeared with all their eyes. I crawled to where Sarah and the children were hiding. When I found them, I hugged them with all that was left of my energy. We had survived. The moment I set foot in that isolated cabin, I knew something was terribly wrong. The fog that had guided me there seemed to cling to the weathered wood, and the silence was so absolute that it felt like a physical presence. But it wasn't until I met the only occupant of the cabin that I realized I had fallen into a nightmare from which I might not be able to escape. I have always been a passionate hiker, proud of my ability to navigate even the most difficult terrain. But that fateful day in the Smoky Mountains, my cabins were tested like never before. The morning had begun clear and bright, perfect conditions for the day hike I had planned. I told my girlfriend that I would be back before nightfall, kissed her goodbye, and left with renewed enthusiasm. The first hours were glorious. The autumn colors were at their peak, painting the mountain slopes with an explosion of golden reds and oranges. The air was fresh and pure, infused with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. I felt alive, connected to nature in a way that city life never allowed me to. But as the day progressed, the weather began to change. The clouds rolled over the sky thick and gray, darkening the sun and causing the temperature to drop several degrees. At first I didn't worry too much. I had walked in worse conditions. But then the fog began to envelop the forest. First it was just a low mist that coiled around the base of the trees, but soon it became a solid wall of white, reducing my visibility to just a few meters. The markers on the trail disappeared into the mist, and suddenly I was no longer sure which direction I should go. I kept going, convinced that I would find my way back, but with each as I passed, the fog became denser, disorienting even more. When twilight began to fall, panic settled in my chest. I was lost. My phone had no signal and the temperature was dropping rapidly. It was then that I saw it, a dim light in the distance, barely visible through the fog. Hope emerged inside a ranger station or the other hikers' camp. I headed towards the hidden routes, and as I got closer, I realized it came from a small cabin, its windows glowing warmly in the growing darkness. Relief flooded me. Surely whoever was inside. It could help me find my way back. I climbed the porch steps, my feet crunching through frost-covered leaves. The old wood groaned under my weight. I raised my hand to knock on the door. But first that my knuckles could make contact, the door opened by itself. A man was standing there, lit by the twinkling light of a fire. He was older, probably in his 60s, with a long, matted beard and eyes that seemed to glow in the gloom. For a moment we stared at each other in silence. Only the crackle of the fire and my gasping breath broke the stillness. "Well, well," he finally said in a harsh voice, as if I hadn't spoken for a long time. "I'd better go in." I doubted. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but the fog was still outside and the cold was already seeping into my bones. I had no choice. I took a step inside. The warmth of the cabin enveloped me like a blanket. It was a single room, sparsely furnished but cozy. The fire roared in a stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But it was those walls that made my blood run cold. There were photographs everywhere, hundreds of them covering every available surface, and in each one I saw the same thing. Hikers like me, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. The man must have noticed my reaction, because he let out a low laugh and hoarse. "You like my collection?" he asked, moving to stand between me and the door. Panic went up through me throat. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Look, I'm only lost, if you could tell me how to get back to the trail, I'll leave right away." The old man shook his head slowly with a predatory smile. "Oh, it's not that simple, son," he said, his voice almost funny. "You know the fog brought you here, and once the fog brings someone, it won't let go." My heart started beating violently. I rolled my eyes back across the room looking for a weapon, a way out, anything. But he blocked the only door, and the windows were covered with thick wooden shutters. He was trapped. Why did I manage to ask? My voice, just a whisper. The man's eyes became glassy, as if he were seeing something I couldn't. "The fog provides," he murmured. "He brings me what I need, and in return I fed her." I didn't understand what he was saying, and I didn't want to. I just knew I had to get out of there. When he turned to stoke the fire, I jumped at my chance, darted for the door, my fingers scratching the doorknob. But he was faster than he looked. His hand closed around my arm with surprising force, pulling me back. I stumbled, knocking over a table. Photographs fell to the ground, the faces of hikers staring at me from the ground. "No need to fighting," he said almost tenderly. "It will be easier if you accept it." But I didn't think I'd accept anything. I closed my fist and hit him with all my might. He staggered backwards, surprised. I took advantage of the moment to grab the first thing I saw, a cast iron pan hanging by the fireplace. What followed was a desperate struggle. It was stronger than it seemed, driven by a madness that I couldn't understand, but I had something else, a fierce will to survive. We hit each other, we bumped into the furniture, scattering photographs all over the room. Finally I managed to free myself with all my might. I hit him with the frying pan. He collapsed on the floor like a puppet without strings. For an instant I just stood there panting, the frying pan still trembling in my hands. He was dead. I didn't stay to find out. I ran out of the cabin and I went into the fog, not knowing where I was going, only knowing that I had to flee. I ran blind, feeling the fog enveloping me like a shroud. The branches scratched my face and the hidden roots tried to trip me up, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The forest seemed infinite. I had no idea where I was going. The fog devoured everything, eliminating any visual reference. At times I felt that I was running in circles. The terror began to take hold in my mind. What if I never found the way out? If the fog held me here forever? My breath was a ragged gasp when finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw a glimmer of hope. The fog was beginning to dissipate. The shadow of the trees was becoming less dense, and suddenly the ground beneath my feet became firmer. A few more steps and I stumbled upon a path, not just any trail. The same trail, the same one I had started my walk that morning. I fell to my knees, exhausted and shaking. I looked around. The forest was still the same, but it no longer seemed twisted. It didn't seem to move with a life of its own. I looked behind me. There was nothing. There was no cabin. There was no fog. Just the trees, motionless and indifferent. But I knew the truth. I knew that the cabin had been there, that the man had been there, that something in that forest, something in that fog, had chosen me and taken me to it. My muscles numb from the cold and fear, I staggered up and followed the path. This time without stopping I walked without looking back, without giving myself a chance to hesitate. When I finally saw the parking lot where I had left my car, I felt a lump in my throat. My car was still there. waiting for me like if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't been on the verge of becoming in one of those photographs. I went up, started the engine with trembling hands and drove without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached my girlfriend's house. She greeted me with a mixture of relief and concern. "What happened? Why are you so pale?" I tried to explain to her. I told her about the fog in the old man's cabin. But as she spoke, I realized of how absurd it sounded. "And so did she, love. I think you were dehydrated or maybe in shock," she said, holding my hands. "The fog can play tricks on you." I wanted to argue, but seeing the disbelief on her face, I stopped. She would never understand, no one would, but I knew the truth. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to find information about the cabin. I checked old maps, reports of missing hikers, something that could confirm what I experienced. I didn't find anything. No one talked about a cabin in that area of the forest. No ranger had ever seen it. It was as if it had never existed. But I know that it exists even today, when the clouds go down and the fog covers the ground. I remember the sound of that man's voice. I remember his look when he said that the fog fed him. And every time I see a school of thick fog, I walk away, because I know that somewhere in those mountains keep waiting for the cabin, the man, and an empty space on the wall waiting for the photograph of his next victim. The moment the electricity went out and plunged the office building into darkness, I knew this night shift would become a fight for survival. As the emergency lights flickered, casting haunting shadows down the empty hallways, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The sound of glass breaking echoed from downstairs, and my heart started pounding. This wasn't a simple blackout. Someone was breaking in. I had been working as a night security guard at Pinnacle Tower for a little over months. It was a comfortable job, perfect for a graduate student like me who needed time to study most nights ago. I would check the cameras and then settle in with my books until dawn. The 50-story building was always deserted at night, just me and the hum of the air conditioning. But tonight was different. A massive storm had hit the kind of storm that makes windows shake and lights flicker. I had been watching it as lightning lit up the city skyline with bright flashes. When the electricity finally went out around 2 a.m., I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was how quickly the backup generator failed. That shouldn't have. I was in the security office on the ground floor when the building went dark. For a moment, I just sat waiting for the generators to activate. But as the seconds turned into minutes and only the dim emergency light flickered faintly, I knew something was wrong. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of glass shattering, followed by whispering voices and stealthy footsteps. Blood froze. This was not a coincidence. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the electricity, and now they were inside. I grabbed the phone to call the police, but the line was dead. My cell phone had no signal. The storm must have knocked down the nearest tower. I was alone. The training kicked in, and I moved quickly to the bank of security monitors. Most of them were turned off, but some cameras with battery were still working. I could see shadowy figures moving around the lobby. Their faces hidden by masks were at least 4, maybe more, and they were armed. My mind was working at full speed. What could they want? The building housed mostly law firms and financial offices. Then I realized the 47th floor belonged to a high-security data storage company. Whatever was on those servers had to be valuable enough to justify this elaborate theft. I had to make a decision. I could try to sneak out, save myself and alert the authorities, or I could stay and try to stop them. The sensible part of my brain was screaming at me to run, but a stronger instinct prevailed. This building was my responsibility. I couldn't just abandon it. I took a deep breath and I grabbed my flashlight and my security card. The card was crucial. It would allow me to access any part of the building, even without electricity. I hesitated, for the little pepper spray can on my belt wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I left the security office with my heart beating so loud I was sure the intruders could hear it. The lobby was eerily quiet. They must have gone further into the building. I made my way to the emergency staircase, knowing that the elevators would be useless without power. As I began the long climb, I tried formulating a plan. I had to get to the 47th floor before them to secure what they were looking for. But how could a simple unarmed security guard stop a group of armed criminals around the 20th floor? I heard a door open somewhere below me. Voices echoed in the stairwell, approaching. I froze, sticking against the wall, barely daring down floors, and then disappeared when Unner opened and closed again. They were checking each floor methodically. I kept putting my legs up, burning with effort. By the time I got to the 40th floor, I was panting, sweat soaking my uniform, but I couldn't stop. I could hear them again, closer. This time I finally got to the 47th floor. I swiped my security card with trembling hands, feeling a relief when the door clicked as it opened. I slipped inside, finding myself in a maze of server racks. The room it was humming to the sound of cooling fans running on battery. I made my way to the main control terminal, the ASUV. My flashlight dancing over rows of flashing lights. I had enough basic training in the building systems to know how to initiate an emergency shutdown. This would fry the servers, destroying any data the intruders wanted. But it would also cause millions of dollars in damage and possibly ruin countless businesses. I could really do that. Before I could decide, I heard the stairwell door open. They were here. I quickly turned off my flashlight and hid behind a rack of servers, my heart hammering on my chest. Of lanterns cut through the darkness. As the intruders entered the room, I could hear them talking quietly, discussing which servers to attack. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small as possible. Fast, whispered one of them. We have 10 minutes before the police arrived. Someone had managed to alert the authorities. That changed things. If I could delay them for a few more minutes without thinking too much. I stood up tall. There I screamed, trying to make my voice sound more confident than I felt. Safe hands where I could see them. For a moment there was a stunned silence. Then a harsh voice laughed. Well, it seems that we forgot one. Take care of it. From him, boys. Two haze of light turned towards me. I saw the D of gun barrels and acted on pure instinct. I sprayed the pepper spray into a wide arc, listening with satisfaction to the screams of pain in response. Then I ran away from servants, the sound of the chase on my heels. A shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting against the metal dangerously close to my head. I ducked and changed direction, my mind working at full speed. Needed a quick plan. Then I remembered the fire suppression system. Like many data centers, this used a gas-based system that removed oxygen from the room in the event of a fire. It was a potentially lethal measure of last resort for anyone trapped inside, but right now it was my only option. I made my way to the control panel, struggling with my security card behind me. I heard the intruders recovering, reaching out to look for me. Just as I felt a hand grabbing my shoulder, I pressed the emergency button. The alarms roared and a computerized voice announced the imminent release of the gas. The hand on my shoulder suddenly let go of me while panic took hold of the intruders. Abort, everyone. Outside, someone shouted. I took advantage of the confusion to sneak away and run to the stairs. I could hear them behind me, no longer caring about their mission, just to escape the gas. We went out to the staircase together, a chaotic mass of desperate bodies descending at full speed. They hit me against the wall several times, but I kept moving, driven by adrenaline. Somewhere between the 30th and 20th floors, I heard sirens. The cavalry had arrived. The intruders must have heard it too, because their descent became even more frantic. As we approached the ground floor, I made a quick decision. I let myself be left behind and hid in a random flat. The intruders kept coming down. Too focused on escaping to notice my absence. Panting, I leaned against the wall and heard the chaos unfold below. Screams, more sirens, the sound of footsteps running. After a few minutes the silence fell. Cautiously, I returned to the staircase and descended into the lobby. I was met with a sea of flashing lights and police officers with their guns drawn. Someone shouted. I raised my hand slowly. I'm security, I said in a hoarse voice. I was the one who called. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of questions and statements. The police captured 3 of the TRUs, but at least 2 managed to escape. The data center was safe, although it would take days to restore the entire system. At dawn, I sat on the steps of the building with a thermal blanket over the shoulders. A detective came over with an expression of respect mixed with disbelief. That was the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen in my life. He said, you could have died. I nodded, too exhausted to argue. I did the right thing, I asked. He was silent for a moment before answering. You saved millions of dollars in data and helped catch some very dangerous guys. Yes, boy, I think you did the right thing. As I watched them come out the sun over the city, I felt a mixture of relief, pride, and a lingering fear. I knew I would probably lose my job. No security company would want a guard who took such foolish risks, but sitting there knowing that I faced incredible danger and made it out alive, I couldn't regret it. That night changed me and showed me what I'm capable of when I'm on the edge, and even though I hope I'll never face something like this again, now I know that if I do, I'll be ready. The moment his eyes met mine in the rearview mirror, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The kind stranger I picked up on this desolate highway wasn't a desperate traveler. He was a predator, and I'd invited him into my car. I've always considered myself a good judge of character, a skill that has served me well in my work as a salesman. It's a wanderer. But on that stormy night, as I drove down the winding mountain roads of Colorado, my instinct failed me spectacularly. The day had started off like any other. I left Denver early with the intention of getting to Salt Lake City before dark. But as I climbed higher into the Rockies, the weather abruptly changed. What started as a light rain quickly turned into a torrential downpour, reducing the visibility just a few feet away. I probably should have stopped in one of the small towns I'd passed. But I had an important meeting in the morning, one that could define my quarter. So I kept going, white-knuckled on the steering wheel as I navigated the treacherous curves of the road. That's when I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road, his thumb outstretched and soaked to the bone in the brief. Flash from my headlights, glimpses of his middle-aged face with a beard and a hope's expression in despair when she saw me approaching. I hesitated for a moment to pick up a hitchhiker. It was risky, especially in weather like this, but the thought of leaving someone abandoned in the storm was unbearable to me. Plus the reason, I'm a big guy. If something went wrong I could defend myself. I turned to the shoulder, the sound of wet gravel crunching under my tires. The man ran to the passenger door and I leaned over to unlock. Thank you, he said as he climbed the water dripping from his clothes on my upholstery. I thought he was going to die out there, no problem. I replied, going back to the car. Where you're going? Only to the next town. He replied in a barely audible voice over the sound of rain. My truck broke down a few kilometers ago. I thought to find a mechanic. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. Well, you're lucky. I think there is a workshop about 20 kilometers away. I can drop you off there. I appreciate it very much, he said, and after a pause he added, Hey, you have something to drink? I'm dry as a clear desert. I replied, reaching for the water bottle in the cup holder. Here you go. While holding the bottle, several things happened in quick succession. His hand darted not towards the water but towards the steering wheel at the same time. I felt something cold and hard pressing against my ribs. A gun keeps driving, or his voice now lacking the old gratitude. And don't do anything stupid. My mind raced, adrenaline racing through my body. This couldn't be happening. These things only happen in movies and crime novels, but the barrel of the gun against my side was too real. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, if you want money I've got cash. Wallet, it's in my jacket pocket, just take it and go. He laughed, a dry, humorless laugh. Oh, I'll keep your money, of course, but that's not all I want. My blood froze. The possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last, they flashed through my mind. Take the next one to the right, he ordered, pointing with the gun to a detour that was barely distinguishable in the darkness. I obeyed, guiding the car down a path of dirt that went into the forest, the trees closing in around us, their branches banging against the windows like skeletal fingers. Stop here, he said. After going a mile I stepped on the brakes, leaving the engine running. The rain kept hitting the windshield, and in the distance thunder rolled like a warning of what was to come now. Here's what you're going to do, he continued, his calm tone and methodical. You're going to get out of the car slowly. Then you're going to walk towards those trees. Don't look back. Don't say anything. Just walk. Understood? I nodded, my mouth too dry to answer. My mind was working at full speed. What wanted to make me, assault me, and leave me abandoned in the middle of nowhere, or worse, while I reached for the door handle. A desperate plan started to form in my head. It was risky, probably suicidal, but it was my only chance. I opened the door slowly, letting the cold, damp air hit me as I pretended to get out. I let myself fall back towards the steering wheel, banging the horn with all my might. The shrill sound filled the air. I took advantage of its moment of confusion and threw myself on the gun, struggling to snatch it from him. Into a chaotic fight inside the car, the horn kept sounding as I struggled, my hands scratching and pushing in a desperate attempt to save my life. The shot reverberated inside the car, momentarily deafening. An intense burning ran down my left arm, but I didn't let go. Somehow in the confusion, my foot pressed the accelerator. The car roared forward, the tires skidding in the mud before finding traction. I staggered violently down the dirt road, hitting potholes and fallen branches. At the last moment I saw the sharp curve that was coming. If we continued in that direction we would fall down a ravine. I had to choose to fight for the weapon or save the car. I dropped the weapon and grabbed the steering wheel with both hands, turning it with all my strength. The car skidded sideways in the mud, the edge of the road, approaching too fast. For an instant I thought it would overturn. They found grip and the car stopped a few centimeters from the precipice. The impact threw my attacker against the passenger door. His head hit the window with a thud and the gun fell from his fingers. I didn't wait to check if he was still conscious. I put the car in reverse, away from the edge, and turned back towards the main road. My arm was burning where the bullet had grazed me, but the adrenaline kept the pain at bay. When I finally returned to the asphalt, I saw something that almost made me cry, tears of relief, red and blue lights flashing in the distance. Someone had heard the shot. I stopped on the shoulder, my legs shaking. So much so that I could barely let go of the pedals. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of questions and medical attention. The man in my car, according to the police, was a criminal wanted in 3 states for a series of violent car thefts. He took advantage of the storms and the deserted roads to lure good Samaritans and turn them into their victims sitting in the back of an ambulance, a blanket over my shoulders. The weight of what happened finally hit me. I had almost died. A detective taking my statements stopped looking at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You took a serious gamble," he said. "Most would have just given him the car." I nodded, feeling the pang of my injured arm. "I don't know what happened to me," I admitted alone. "I couldn't let it win." The detective patted me on the shoulder. "Well, thanks to you. He won't hurt anyone else again. You're a hero." Believe it or not, the word hero sounded strange to me. I didn't feel like one. I felt exhausted, sore, and more than a little traumatized. But when I saw my attacker being put in a patrol car, I felt a little more pride. I had faced evil face to face. I had looked at death and survived. In the following weeks, I reflected a lot about that night, about the rain, the gun, the moments when I thought everything was lost. But above all, I thought about that decisive second in which I decided to fight. I had always considered myself a cautious person, risk-averse, but when my life was at stake, I found within myself a bravery I never knew I had. Was a revelation. Now, when I drive on desolate roads, I keep the doors locked and never pick up hitchhikers. But I also drive with a newfound confidence because I know that no matter what challenges life throws at me, I have the strength to face them head-on. On that stormy night in the mountains of Colorado, not only did I survive, I triumphed, and that's something that no storm, no weapon, nor can they ever take away any threat from me.